Okay, let's open tonight's conversation with a question. What is consciousness? And in order for us to understand the answer to this question, we have to understand our own thinking, our own understanding of sensation, and how we convert stimuli from our external environment by engaging our five senses and then going through a complex network of neurons that is transmitted through the nervous system and then processed in the upper region of our brain. And that allows us to perceive, and it also gives us an understanding of perception, the way we integrate information, the way we organize it, and the way we interpret it. When you got out of your car on your way to class today, and you were walking from the car to this classroom, you probably noticed that there was a change in temperature. You noticed probably that the sun was starting to dim outside. Maybe there was a slight scent in the air. All these various things that we experience with the way in which we actually engage our senses allows us to toggle between different stages, or different degrees, I should say, of both wakefulness and also awareness. So putting the question back to you, how would you define consciousness? Being aware of your surroundings. Anybody want to add anything else to that? Pedro?
I would say that it's like the act to perceive, think, and act based on your environment.
Okay, so we are saying being able to perceive external stimuli in one's environment. That's great. And are some people more aware than others?
Yes.
And I think you wanted to offer some insight.
I was just going to say the perception of oneself.
Perception of oneself. Now, the perception of oneself, is that the only thing that's important?
It's not the only thing, but it's one thing.
So when we think about the inter and intrapersonal relationships that we might have, we realize understanding oneself is certainly an important aspect to this. But what about understanding other people and how we actually move through an experience? Would that be equally important, perhaps? Most likely. There's also a degree of planning involved. I don't think many of us wake up in the morning and get into our car and just go throughout the day as if nothing matters. There's usually this understanding that there is some form of cognitive thought that is involved in planning out one's day. And then we start to prioritize what is important, what's less important. What could I avoid today? What is a must-do on my list for today?
Okay, so I always said that, at least for me, that consciousness is like an evolved instinct.
Mm-hmm.
If we see the animals and how they act, they act through instinct. And for me, at least, I always thought that consciousness was like an evolution of that instinct. Like it was like the next step.
The next step of the evolutionary development for mankind. So you think about the brain and how it was developing throughout the Neanderthal period. In the Neanderthal period, we recognized that the brain was actually larger than Homo sapien. And I don't remember the exact specifications, but I think it might have been something like 2.21 pounds, whereas our brain is 2.86. So then you say to yourself, if Neanderthals had a much larger brain, then why are we far more complex than they are? Well, throughout the course of evolutionary change, our brain started to rewire neural circuits. It started to fine-tune itself. It started to prune back unnecessary regions of the brain to make it more efficient. Now, the really cool part about that is, what if, and this is, of course, a rhetorical question that we cannot answer, but maybe in another 1,000 years, another social scientist will be able to answer this question. What if our next evolutionary development with our brain is sitting right out there on the horizon. If we know that a Neanderthal's brain was much larger than ours to some extent, and that slight difference in weight, what might our capabilities be like if our brain develops yet again to the size of a Neanderthal, but with the complexity of a Homo sapien? It's a profound thought to consider, isn't it? And we can't really observe evolutionary change in one's lifetime because it's over successive generations that it can actually be observed, at least in an environment that's not all that stressed. Our environments are, for the most part, they're stressful, but they're also very predictable for the most part. And as a result of that, it's going to take many, many generations before something like that can even come to fruition. But we realize that we're rather different compared to other species, and it's because we have a much larger brain. Our frontal cortex is more refined and developed. Our cerebral cortex is also more refined and developed. And we stand out when we think about the forebrain when measured against other species. So we recognize that we have the ability to be self-aware. And being self-aware also means that we engage our senses to some relatively reasonable level that allows us to make sense of complex environments for us to be better able or suited to navigate through the complexities of life. And when you think about the fabric of human existence, we also recognize that it does require us to be conscious. But for some of us, that might be difficult, right? We're all here physically, aren't we? And some of you are drifting in and out of consciousness, even though you're awake. Give me a clap if that fits the description for some of you. And that is both what I've said in previous lectures, behavior both predictable and also universal, right? And that is important because when we think about why some individuals are so engaged in their environments and they seem like they pay attention to every single detail, one has to start to think, what is their capacity for full consciousness? How can they be aware and also wakeful for much longer spans of time than us? And that's an important thing because cognitive perspective offers three different perspectives when it comes to global workplace, synchronization, and also radical plasticity theory. And what social scientists are saying in this regard when it comes to global workspace is they're saying that we have a tendency to pay attention to important stimuli right in front of us because we deem it to be necessary, and we also feel that it's important for us to take care of it. In essence, that's why we're in this class right now, or at least for the moment, because we know that it's important for us to fulfill the requirements in order for us to get an associate's degree or even a bachelor's degree. So we engage our global workspace from a cognitive perspective in order to do that. But when we do that, scientists are also saying that our neurons, which are complex, and they are weaved together in a complex neural network where they interact with one another continuously. And what's interesting, and just moving beyond that for a moment, we go to radical plasticity theory, a theory that was proposed that consciousness is actually a learned process. Well, we realize it's a learned process now, but we also realize that as we are learning and as we engage our senses and we try to make sure that we do it to full consciousness, we also recognize that our neurons are reacting to repeated experiences in one's environment. This repeated experience is allowing the neurons to wire together so they can act together, and it provides us with new insights. It provides us with better developmental skills for whatever task that we're talking about, like flow, for example, which we'll get into in just a moment. So radical plasticity theory is important because we recognize that people are able to adapt. We recognize that people are able to adjust and also learn in the process, and this helps with consciousness. Because I know, speaking for myself, getting up at 4 o'clock this morning, and I was drinking a cup of coffee, and I was reading through my book in the morning like I normally do for the first couple hours in the morning, and it's a great way to start the morning. But I found myself for about 30 minutes drifting into an imaginary state. And imagination is a beautiful thing. But when you need to focus on a said activity, that could be a very dangerous thing because you realize you're awake, but yet you're drifting into another aspect of what you shouldn't be doing. And I found myself rereading 3 pages over the course of 30 minutes. And then I got up, I stretched, sat back down, and my focus was a little bit more refined. But you know, if you think about the example they provide in the book, they talk about a thermostat. And the thermostat does not have a conscience, or doesn't have consciousness rather, and nor does it have a conscience. It can't tell whether it's doing something good or bad. But at the same time, it's able to set the temperature the way we program it. It doesn't know if it's too hot. It doesn't know if it's too cold. It just performs according to the way it's programmed. Yet when it comes to us, we have higher levels of consciousness that are not automatic, and we put thought into it. Christine, you're going to say something.
So, like if, let's say, like with AI technology,
Oh.
like if it becomes self-aware, does that mean it has consciousness?
You know, that's actually a fascinating question. I was recently watching something on YouTube, and it had to do with an interview that Elon Musk was in. And he was saying that AI, or artificial intelligence, is an existential threat to our civilization and to humankind. And he was saying part of the problem with AI is that it needs to be regulated by the government. But the problem with government regulation and oversight, because of all the red tape involved, it'll take approximately a decade for legislation to be enacted. But by the time legislation is enacted, AI is already developed well beyond that. In fact, today's AI is going to be different tomorrow and the following day. It just continuously develops. And the danger, according to Musk, is if you program AI where it can be self-replicating, in essence, I guess you could say it's developing a mind of its own. What if AI views us as an existential threat at some point, based on where it's going? So he said that there needs to be some type of ethical governing body that is able to determine what limitations there should be on AI. We're all starting to feel the effects of that. Just go to various stores and notice how many jobs are lost to AI, simple jobs. And that's going to become more complex. In fact, when you think about some members on the Democratic side that are lobbying for a mandated minimum income for all citizens in the United States, the whole reason, according to Musk, that narrative is starting to be discussed is because they realize that when AI gets to a certain level, there is going to be a complete displacement of jobs. So providing people with a basic income will help sustain that. But you could also see how that could be an insufferable existence, because when we think about our own level of consciousness and how we interact within our work environments, as much as we might feel work being insufferable at times, we also realize that work can also make us feel useful. And if you remove work from the equation, in essence, removing your sense of usefulness in your community, what are people left doing? It's an interesting question that has a very dark side to it. Hope that answered it to some degree. So we have 2 dimensions of consciousness that they talk about. The first one is going to be wakefulness and also awareness. When we think about these 2 dimensions, I want everybody to think about the variations that occur in these 2 dimensions in terms of degrees. It's not you're not awake or you are awake. It's at what degree of wakefulness are you presently at? At what degree of awareness are you currently? And for some people in here, that might be very high. For others in here, it might be fluctuating between low and high. And God forbid you were smoking some marijuana before you came in. I know nobody in here would ever do that. But let's just say for a moment that you were smoking marijuana before you came in here for a moment. It's going to act on the nervous system. And as a result of that, it's going to alter your state of perception. And you're going to drift continuously in and out of different levels of consciousness. Kind of like a precursor to the last section of this chapter where it talks about the influence of marijuana and other types of narcotics and also alcohol. And we'll go back to that in a moment. But wakefulness is going to be the degree of alertness reflecting whether a person is awake or if they're sleeping. Whereas awareness is referring to the monitoring of information from the environment and from one's own thoughts. So we see this diagram up here, and what I'd like you to note from this is that we see awareness on one side, and on the x-axis we see wakefulness. We have low awareness measured in degrees, high awareness right here, and then for wakefulness we have low awareness. On the far side of the spectrum we have high wakefulness. So if somebody has low awareness and low wakefulness, we recognize that they're probably going to be in a coma. And when they're in a coma, their eyes are typically closed and the person's unresponsive, and they're also not going to be able to be aroused to some reasonable degree. In other words, they may not wake up from it. And there could be a number of different reasons for that, but basically low wakefulness and low awareness means that you are currently in a coma.
So I'm just curious because I heard that when you're like in a coma, I heard that there's like a lot of people that even though they can like act or like move from like, they still can like hear and feel that they're like they feel that like they're like in a coma, so they cannot like act or like make them, you know?
Okay, you bring up a good point, and we're going to talk about that. But basically what you're referring to is the realm between vegetative state and minimum consciousness. So those two domains actually overlap with one another, and it's called the disorder of consciousness. And what they find right here with the disorder of consciousness is that people are more alert than we previously thought. And we're going to go back to that in a moment. Yeah?
I was in a medically induced coma for a week, and I could actually hear people talking to me.
Interesting.
So where would that be on this?
Would a medically induced coma?
Because my husband showed up like daily, and I remember him talking to me.
I'm not sure to answer your question, but my guess is if a coma is right here,
Right.
low awareness and low wakefulness, maybe you are a little bit higher with awareness and wakefulness. And as a result of it overlapping right here is my guess, somewhere right here, you're able to still pick up on external stimuli, and as a result, you were able to make sense out of conversation. That's an interesting question now. Were you able to recall conversations with relatively decent recall?
I was able to, when I woke up, it took me a while after waking up, but I was able to tell him some things that he was telling me.
Okay, that's interesting.
Like I was able to remember like specific things that he had said to me, not
Uh-huh.
everything, but just little things.
Any response with your eyes? Were you able to do any tracking?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I don't know any of that.
Maybe when you go-
I just remember being able to pick up things that he had said to me.
Yeah, maybe when you go home, ask him if you were able to, if your eyes were open, or when they opened them, if you were able to track it all.
Yeah.
It'd be kind of, I would assume the answer would be no, but I'd be interested to hear that, because you're obviously not in a coma, but you're in a coma, induced.
Yeah,
Which is different.
They ended up putting me under, so it's
Yeah.
not like so it's not an actual coma.
Uh-huh.
A coma. When they medically induce it,
Uh-huh.
it's just kind of like it's above that actually.
Right.
Okay.
So one of the things that the science tells us, and going back to the last time we had a conversation about cats being experimented on, is the reticular formation. And it's a system or a band of axons that runs up through the center of the brainstem. And what we know is that if you're sleeping and you were to jolt somebody with some electrical current into the reticular formation, it would become alert and wakeful. We also know that if we were to lesion through that area of a cat, for example, they would lapse into a coma, they would never wake up again. So one of the things that they recognize with individuals that are actually in a coma is that there's usually damage to the reticular formation. And this is important because if there is damage to the reticular formation, it suggests that they may never wake up again as a result of the brain trauma that they experienced. The science does suggest that if there is normal sleep patterns involved when somebody's in a coma, they're more likely to emerge from it. And it's a great ethical question too, because if they're on life support and the family makes a decision to remove them from life support, did they actually make the right decision? Maybe in some cases the answer is yes. In other instances, they might have maybe misunderstood the degree of which somebody might have been in a coma and basically pulled the plug prematurely. It's an interesting question, and some cases have gotten a lot of publicity, and we're going to go into that with regard to Pedro's question in a short while.
So if somebody is on life support, that means that they cannot physically breathe for themselves, correct?
Correct.
So my question is if they're at that state, you're saying that their brain can actually come back from that and start breathing again, maybe?
I'm not saying that. What the science is saying is that if they ran brain scans and it appears that they have normal sleeping patterns with the way they measure brain activity, it is possible that they can emerge out of a coma and be fine.
So that their brain would actually be like, hey, you can breathe again.
Correct.
Okay.
So a classic example that comes to mind is my best friend Matt. He's a sergeant for the police department in Suffolk County, Long Island. And when we were in college, he was riding his motorcycle. He crashed it. He was going about 90 miles an hour. And he was airlifted to a hospital that I was attending college at. And he was in a coma for just over 30 days. It wasn't self-induced. He was literally in a coma. They didn't think he was going to make it. They had to remove a portion of his skull to release the pressure from his brain. And they wanted to do a new type of surgery on him where they would actually implant something into his brain to monitor the brain, and his father wouldn't allow it. And I'm glad they didn't, because they gave a clear diagnosis to the father and mother saying it is likely that Matthew will not emerge from this coma. At least let the science learn about it. That's the way it was presented. I'm sure they worded it very nicely,
Yeah.
but that's the way it was presented. And the father said, absolutely not. And the mother, being a devout Catholic, she just prayed every day and she didn't leave his bedside. And I think somewhere around 32 days later, he emerged from the coma. Today he's the sergeant for the Suffolk County Police Department. He rides his bicycle about 100 miles, and I'm not even kidding when I say this, about 100 miles a week with a group of guys. And he does have two deficits. One deficit is he can't lift his arm up the way I'm doing it right now. The other deficit is he can't smell. So he can't enjoy food the way he used to. So he eats because he knows he has to live. But he can't smell the food. But he said, I can still feel the texture. So he likes certain things like pizza because he can't taste it, but he can feel the texture associated with it, and he remembers what it tastes like. It's really interesting, actually. But unfortunately, those were the two deficits as a result of him coming out of the coma. Could have been a lot worse, though, right? So just something interesting to think about. It's just something I thought about as we were talking about this. Now, another thing, what we find here, somebody in a vegetative state, they are low awareness and they are high on wakefulness. And this is interesting because an individual like this might have their eyes open for a period of time, but otherwise they seem to be unaware or unresponsive. And one of the interesting things with somebody in a vegetative state, and I think this is when you're starting to hit the upper boundary of vegetative state, which is merging into minimum consciousness, researchers performed an interesting study on a woman that was highly publicized, and they wanted to know if her brain was reacting to verbal conversations, kind of like what you were saying, Christine. So they monitored her brain under a functional MRI using magnetics and also radio waves. And they asked this woman in a vegetative state to imagine walking through your home and also imagine playing tennis. And then they were looking at the way the brain was responding. They did the same thing with a control group, of individuals that were alert and they were not in a coma or a vegetative state, just everyday people like you and I. And the patterns were strikingly similar. And then when she came out of the coma, the vegetative state rather, she was able to recall the conversation as well. Quite interesting. So the reason I'm pointing that out is when we think about the disorders of consciousness, where people are in a vegetative state, but they're actually merging into minimum consciousness, there could be a problem because the textbook says that up to 40% of people with disorders of consciousness may have been categorized as vegetative state, and almost 90% of unresponsive individuals previously considered unclassifiable might have actually been in a minimum conscious state. Now that's significant. So what does that tell us? We don't really know enough about this subject. That's the way I interpret it, in short. And then we also have Sigmund Freud. Now, sitting between the extremes of complete lack of awareness and wakefulness, called the coma, and full awakeness and awareness for full consciousness, sits moderate consciousness. And according to Freud, the preconscious is in this area. And the preconscious for Freud represents an area where people have access to information, but they can't yet retrieve it. And this is typical when we experience a tip of the tongue phenomenon. And two things that come to mind with a tip of the tongue phenomenon is when we know somebody's name, but we forget it. Give me a clap if you've ever done that. And how many of you, like myself, don't want to ask the person, although I asked you, Lisa, earlier, we don't usually want to ask the person because we might be too familiar with them and we don't want to embarrass ourselves. And as a result of that, we're waiting for somebody to walk up and say, Pedro, or we're waiting for somebody to walk up and say, Jada, and then that is the primer that alerts us to say, okay, now I remember their name. How did I forget that? Give me a clap if that's relatable. Pedro, you're going to say something.
I'm just gonna ask, why does that happen? Like, if you're like in a state of like conscious, like wakefulness, you're like completely awake, completely like, you know, why does the thing about the tip of the tongue phenomenon happen?
It's a good question. I don't think I've ever heard an explanation to fully satisfy my understanding of it. But I do think we are often distracted with life. We're often distracted with things that are going on in that moment. And as a result, we constantly forget things. I do it all the time. I do it even more so now. And I don't think it's because I'm getting older necessarily. It could reasonably be the reason. But I think it's because there's so much stimuli in our environments. Just think about something I said, I think, in Chapter 1. We are bombarded with approximately 140 million pieces of stimuli every single second. We're only able to retrieve or retain approximately 20 to 40 pieces of information every second. That's not a lot when you think about it. So just to give you an understanding of how complex that is, that means, and I'm going to use you, Lisa, as an example, that means Lisa would be able to recall every specific fact with every person in here. Color of your skin, color of your eyes, your hair color. What do your fingernails look like? What are you wearing? Solid color, striped color, what is it? What kind of glasses? Imagine the enormous amount of brain power involved with that level of detail. Your brain would be on overload. So it makes sense that we only pay attention to relevant information that is important to us at that moment. Now, maybe the person's name is really not that important to us for some strange reason, and that could realistically be the case. I do recognize with students that tend to talk to me more frequently, I tend to remember them more. That's why I remember some people in here more so than others, because of the level of interaction. Another interesting example with the tip of the tongue phenomenon has to do with test taking. We've all been there. We studied for long periods of time. We know the material. We sit down to take the test. We get to the question, you know it, but you can't remember the answer. You take an educated guess, you're frustrated, you end your exam, you walk out of class, and you say to yourself, that's the answer, but I can't change it. Give me a clap if that's ever happened. But it's interesting because for some strange reason, it sits there on the periphery of our preconsciousness, and if for some strange reason, something occurs that dislodges that memory, and all of a sudden, it's in your conscious thought. You are now aware of the answer to that question. Yet you sit there and you toil for 5 to 7 minutes before you finally just gave up and moved on to the next question. It's fascinating. Happens all the time. And you know, one of the things that's interesting with Freud, and I really think the world of Freud, I wouldn't consider myself to be a psychoanalytic, although I do think they are brilliant people. But he's interesting. And he wrote a book in November of 1899 that he published in 1900, basically to tell the world, be on notice that this book is going to revolutionize the world. Not just psychology, but the world. And it was called The Interpretation of Dreams. And he talks about the royal road to the unconsciousness. And this is important. And it's important because what Freud's basically saying is that our psychoanalytic mind can be subdivided into 2 parts. Manifest content and also latent content. For Freud, the manifest content of a particular dream is when we remember what the dream's meaning actually is. The latent content, according to Freud, is when we have a dream that seems really strange and we know that it doesn't have any real practical use for us in life because it's not manifest, but it's symbolic. What does the symbolism represent? Give you an example. When my life went into a spiral economically in the aftermath of the Great Recession and my 6-digit income evaporated, I remember having a dream where I fell from a tall, high-rise building in Manhattan. Now, I don't know if it was in Manhattan, but it looked like the buildings in Manhattan. And just before I hit the floor, I woke up. Now, that's not manifest content. That's latent content. And what does that mean? Well, I don't know. I can interpret it. What does the symbolism of that dream represent to me? Well, when I analyzed what was going on in my life right at that moment, I recognized that I felt like I was falling from grace. And I felt like my life was unraveling before me. And I had no control. But I did have control to wake up at that moment just before I hit the sidewalk. And I think when I think about the symbolism behind that, I think it has to do with the circumstances unfolding around my life at that moment. Now, anybody have a weird dream that they'd like to share? You've got one. I want to hear it. Jada?
I got one. I had a recurring dream for a very, very long time that I would be somewhere and my teeth would all fall out. No idea. Like they would just start falling out of my mouth and my hands.
Did you ever try to come up with a symbolic meaning of what that could mean?
I looked at dream books. I've tried looking up all different things on the internet about it, and like there was like 30 ways to interpret it. But honestly, I had no idea to this day. But I don't have them anymore. But I used to have them all the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
So, these dreams are all pretty common, like falling, going into water. Okay. I've always been able to change my dreams inside the dream. So I would be falling, but I would develop wings.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you're experiencing lucid dreaming. So with lucid dreaming, you have more awareness, and you also have more wakefulness. And I've done that too. I've thrown myself out of a big plane that wasn't going to crash, and I threw myself out of the plane without a parachute, and I was flying around, and I felt like Superman. Really bizarre, strange, but that's another example of lucid dreaming. And we've probably all done that on occasion, and when we dream like that, you don't want to emerge from it because you feel powerful, you feel liberated, and it feels good. And I agree with you. So I don't think you're lucid dreaming all the time, but when you do, you realize that you feel powerful.